I hope you all had a great winter break and are coming back refreshed and rejuvenated. All right, it looks like our waiting room is empty right now, so we will go ahead and get started. And as more people come in, we'll let them enter. So, welcome everyone to the ECE Voices Advocacy Training. This is our 5-session advocacy training program we're kicking off in 2024. If you joined us in 2023, we did a lot of those budget basics, legislature basics, and now we're really going into some of that nitty-gritty of developing your advocacy plan and what are some of the things that you can do as an advocate. We're actually starting off this session by talking about advocating for a 501c3, whether that's on behalf of your organization or what you can do as an individual, even if you're employed by a 501c3. We've been hearing from a lot of our community advocates that maybe there's restrictions from your employer on what you are and aren't allowed to do, whether you work for a nonprofit, a county office of ed, or a school district. There are probably some guidelines in place that your employer has for you. And so we want to clear up any misconceptions that might be out there as far as what you're able to do as a community advocate and as a member of ECE Voices. So today, I am stepping in for our advocacy coordinator, Justina Erpelding. My name is Jenny Mensch, and I'm the professional development coordinator here at Every Child California. And my co-presenter today is our wonderful board member, Jennifer Torres. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Jennifer Torres. I'm the enrollment and recruitment manager for Northern California Child Development Incorporated. We are a nonprofit 501c3, so this is kind of right up my alley. I'm also the direct contracting chair on the Every Child California board and a lead advocate for Region 2.
And a lead advocate. Wonderful. Yeah, so if you're part of Region 2, Jennifer Torres is your lead. So she's got a lot of great insight as far as advocacy as well. All right, since these trainings this year are really focused on developing our strategies and our plans, we'd really like to hear from you and kind of increase our engagement to start off this webinar. So whether you'd like to unmute, Adam can maybe assist us with that, or if you want to put in the chat, just give a little bit of an introduction about yourself, maybe your name, what you brought to the training, something you're hoping to learn, and just let us know if you've been told to be careful with advocacy or even not to advocate at all.
Hello, my name is Courtney. I work for Educational Enrichment Systems. It is an early education agency in San Diego. And I am in a newer role. I'm a program director. And so I'm kind of using this as a way to just kind of continue to get my foot in the door. And our previous president and CEO, Robin Layton, kind of paved a way for us to get ourselves in and advocate for early childhood education. So we're kind of just continuing on her legacy.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us today, Courtney. Well, I know for myself, I'm with Every Child California. I've been here since May of last year, so I'm pretty new, but I've spent my whole career in nonprofits and even working for the federal government in the National Park Service. And so I know that the advocacy space has been something that a lot of the organizations I've worked for in the past have really shied away from or said, we're not going to touch that. So I'm really excited to be bringing this training to you today. And you can continue to introduce yourself into the chat, but we are going to keep on going. And we're actually going to start with a poll. And if some of these questions you don't know the answer, that's all right. This is sort of our preview poll to kind of give you a good idea of what we will be talking about in today's training. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to look through the poll and answer some of these questions. I do have it up on the slide as well. If it's difficult for you to use the poll feature, you can also put your answers in the chat. If you're just joining us, we're doing sort of an introduction poll to our webinar today. Feel free to answer the poll that's popped up or put your answers in the chat if that's easier for you. We've got probably about 2 more minutes on the poll as answers are coming in. All right, we are going to end the poll at this point, and we are actually going to revisit these questions at the end and kind of go over the answers together at the end, because hopefully throughout this presentation, you'll learn the answers to some of those. And so be thinking about these questions as we go through the presentation and see if you can match up sort of your early answers to what you're going to answer at the end. All right. So we're going to really start off our education part of this presentation by talking about 501c3s, what is a nonprofit, and what makes 501c3s special when compared to other organizations. And sort of the easiest way that I've always thought about it is dividing for-profits versus nonprofits. And no, that doesn't mean that nonprofits aren't allowed to make money. They most certainly are. When you think about a nonprofit versus a for-profit, any of that surplus revenue, that profit at the end of the year, nonprofits reinvest in their mission, in their programs, in their services. Whereas for-profit companies might take that surplus, take those profits, and put it out to shareholders, put it out to the owner, put it out to board members. Nonprofits do not do that. They reinvest that profit back into their goals. And so the government recognizes that charitable and certain other types of organizations are providing valuable community services that would be impossible for the government to provide using taxpayer funds. So nonprofits are kind of like those organizations that stand in the gap between what would be amazing for the government to fund, like if the world was perfect, and what they are actually able to fund. Nonprofits kind of fill that space. And while the government can't fully support nonprofit organizations, the IRS has come up with this 501c3 code that classifies them as tax exempt. So when nonprofits don't have to pay taxes on the donations or on the funds that they raise, that stretches their dollars farther and makes it easier for them to continue providing their valuable services to the community. Now, there's a couple different requirements or rules about how can you become a nonprofit and what the IRS defines as where your income comes from if you're a nonprofit. But in the most general sense, nonprofits typically receive at least 1/3 of their income from the public in some way, shape, or form. And there are a number of different types of 501c3s. The one that comes to mind most for me is always those charities. So food banks, relief organizations, environmental organizations, human rights organizations. But 501c3s can also be education institutions like schools, scientific organizations, even private foundations. Private foundations are a little different from the nonprofits we normally think of because they don't usually have those active programs and services. They're not usually working directly with the community, and they're often granting money to other organizations who are working towards the same goal. The IRS is very specific about what they consider to be charitable activities for 501c3 nonprofits. And I'm not going to read through all of these. We'll provide the slides for you after. But in general, Activities that are considered charitable by the IRS fall under some of these categories, like providing relief for the poor, distressed, and underprivileged, advancing science or education, eliminating prejudice and discrimination, defending human and civil rights secured by law, and combating community deterioration. And there are restrictions. So 501c3s get these benefits, right? Like the tax exemption and the ability to receive grants from certain organizations, the ability to receive certain government funds. But there are restrictions that are in place that are designed so that nonprofits focus their efforts on charitable causes and don't get distracted into that sort of for-profit world, right? So that's why these restrictions are in place. So nonprofits do have to abide by the following restrictions. The first one is that they may not serve the interests of the founder, the founder's family, shareholders, or others with controlling interests in the organization. So that goes back to for-profits. When they have that surplus, they can share that with the founder, they can share that with their shareholders. Nonprofits cannot do that. Nonprofits must use their donations for the sole purpose of advancing the stated charitable cause. So our mission here, Every Child California, we inspire and educate. So our donations go towards that mission. They don't go toward us selling t-shirts, right? Nonprofits may not engage in political advocacy or lobbying as a primary activity. And that's where I want you to focus right now. So primary activity. That doesn't say we can't do advocacy or lobbying at all, but it cannot be a substantial part. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Nonprofits may not donate directly to any political candidate's campaign fund, and nonprofits may not campaign actively for any political candidates. So in general, when you're thinking about the advocacy and lobbying work that a nonprofit can do, it has to be nonpartisan or not tied to a certain political candidate. And as it says on the screen, nonprofit organizations can support specific legislation or advocate for their cause as long as it's not a significant part of their programs and activities. And this slide is direct from the IRS. And so I just wanted to point out where it says, no organization can qualify for this status if a substantial part of their activities is attempting to influence legislation. And there are people who are a lot more on the legal and tax side of knowing what substantial part of those activities mean. But from where I've always sat in nonprofits, what I see that as, well, if I see that my organization is focused on our programs and advocacy is just a part of what we do, then I feel like we're on the right track, and I let the specific tight tracking of that substantial part go to people at that higher level. A 501c3 organization can engage in some lobbying, but too much lobbying activity risks loss of the tax-exempt status.
So
and
oh,
sorry, you can go back.
No, you go.
Okay. And then I just want to go back to that idea of nonprofits are there to benefit the community. And that's why we have those restrictions. And Jennifer is going to go into a lot more detail about what that looks like in practice. But Justina had shared this really great quote with me, and makes me feel really good as someone who, works for a nonprofit, is nonprofits symbolize the best of America. They provide an avenue for like-minded people to work together for a common cause and support the mission through donations and volunteerism. America's 1.5 million nonprofits feed, heal, shelter, educate, inspire, enlighten, and nurture. Every day, nonprofit organizations are strengthening communities. So working for an educational organization, working for a nonprofit organization, you are out there strengthening communities and providing that great benefit. And that's why this advocacy is so important. And Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So advocacy is a really important part of our jobs. We don't think about it as much as the services that we might be providing to our families and our community, but we're always doing advocacy on some kind of level, whether it's you're going with a family to do a IEP meeting, that's a form of advocacy. Our voices matter, and sometimes our voices are the only ones that are heard, because a lot of times we're serving communities that are marginalized and don't have a voice. And so advocacy is vital to how things are changed for the better for our communities and our families and the children that we serve. And honestly, the people that our staff are probably some of the best people to talk about issues within early childhood, just because they're in the trenches every single day, and so they actually know what's going on. I mean, we could sit here and talk about behavior issues all day long, because we know that there is a lot of that happening right now. And so but those stories, that's what we need for change to happen, because when those stories are suppressed, then nobody hears what's going on, and then you don't understand, why isn't anything changing? Well, the story isn't being told. So advocacy is really about you telling the story of what's going on in your community and in your program. When I started doing advocacy, I really didn't understand a whole lot about it. I just knew I had a special passion for being that voice for the families that I serve. Sorry. And sorry about that. I lost my train of thought. I have a special passion for advocating. So there was a lot of times when, but I didn't really understand a whole lot of what advocacy meant when it came to going to like the Capitol and things like that. So there was a lot of work that I had to do on my end to make sure that I was staying within my own lane, so that I didn't get my nonprofit in trouble. But it is one of the things that you can do is, this is probably one of the best things that you could ever do for your programs. And there's a lot that you can do as an advocate without getting your nonprofit in trouble. So like Jenny was saying, you can even do lobbying. And just so you know, the substantial part of what you had said, Jenny, is it's actually 1/3 of your budget is dedicated to lobbying. So as long as it's not 1/3, you don't meet that criteria. I actually read out that on the IRS website. All right, can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So advocacy and lobbying are actually the same thing. So all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So there's different pieces to advocacy. Lobbying is just one of those pieces. We can't, so 501c3s, like I said, can't use a substantial amount or 1/3 of their resources lobbying, but it's not necessarily prohibited. And then we are allowed to advocate for things that we believe in or against issues that we don't. We can't use a significant majority of our time and money to do this, and there's certain levels to that. So it's 1/3 of your budget. And then also, if you spend $5,000 or more per quarter, that is actually needs to be reported. It's this whole thing. But there are certain things that you have to stay abreast of and aware of, so that you don't get caught up in being considered a lobbyist. Some of the things that you can do is urge your government representatives and the government to change its policies, rules, and regulations and adopt new ones. That's not lobbying. We can help develop a policy position. Matter of fact, if you go on Every Child California's website, we have policy positions, and Every Child is a nonprofit organization. It's a 501c3. And you can testify at committee hearings. So if you get called on to go to a committee hearing for your subject matter expertise, you are allowed to do that, and that is not considered lobbying. So there's quite a few things that you can do that's not lobbying, but it's still advocacy. Okay, we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of the things that you really need to stay away from is endorsing candidates on behalf of 501c3. You should only do that as an individual. So, I mean, we all have our own political opinions. So if you're on social media and you're posting about the candidate that you like the most, make sure it's on your personal social media and not your organization's social media. You can host candidate forums, so you can invite the candidates that are running for an office to come and speak, but you have to invite all the candidates and not just the one that you particularly care for. And you have to ask the questions fairly to everyone, and the seating has to be random. So there are a couple of things that you have to do to show that there's no favoritism. You can support and oppose ballot initiatives and legislation. And but your 501c3 cannot support or oppose candidates. So you can't put out a position statement against a specific candidate. That's actually not allowed. However, as an individual, as a person away from work and away from ECE Voices and Every Child California, you can do whatever you want, just not as a representative of any of those other things. All right, we'll go on to the next slide. So this is actually what I really wanted to talk about, because there's different pieces to advocacy and lobbying. It's actually quite a small piece, but it's the one that we hear about the most, because it's the one where people get into the most trouble with. But there are a couple other advocacy areas that I wanted to talk about. One is administrative. This one is actually pretty interesting, mainly because it's after the fact. So once a policy has been put into practice, it's how you are interpreting it and how you're putting it into practice in your own programs, writing policies and procedures. But also it's when a policy or a regulation that has come down from either the federal or state government, and you don't agree with it, and you're working with your representatives to change it or to get it to be more appropriate. So, and we do that all the time. Last summer, I think, was it last summer or in the fall, there was a lot of polls going out from Every Child California, because they were sending out questionnaires and things like that because of a lot of the changes that were happening, and they wanted that information to pass it off to our local government or state government, so that they would understand that a lot of the stuff that they were doing was having such an impact. Another way that you can advocate at an administrative level is if you're running a Head Start program, they're doing the new proposed rulemaking and turning in comments to the federal government, to the Office of Head Start, or if they do comment periods for state legislation too. When you turn your comments in, that's actually advocacy at an administrative level. So there are lots of things that you can do at an administrative level when it comes to advocacy. The next one I want to talk about is legislative advocacy. So this is the one that probably everybody is the most familiar with. It's where we are sending emails to our legislators and making phone calls and telling our legislators about the regulations or what we need, or the policies and regulations that need to be changed, or we need a new policy or regulation. That's actually the advocacy that most people are the most familiar with. So it's a lot of times it's testifying before legislative committees, it's making those phone calls, it's doing the emails, working with our own administrators to get proposals adopted, meeting with staff of the governor's office and the legislator to draw attention to issues. So we've had this conversation in board meetings where Southern California is much different than Northern California. So whatever there are some issues that might be in Southern California is not necessarily going to be happening in Northern California, and vice versa. So when we're having those conversations with our legislators, our conversations might be looking different, but we're still having those conversations with our legislators. The great thing about doing that kind of advocacy is you have stories that you can take to your legislator. And most importantly, and this is my favorite, is taking the data with you. So if you're running data and saying, hey, look, legislator, 50% of my kids that I'm serving in my program have A, B, and C, and the regulations are not meeting the needs. And we're seeing this trend and it's going this way. And we're giving them that data, because they're not going to make any changes without some kind of data to support it, just like anything else. So that's your story. Your stories are really important, and this is how you get it to your legislators. And then my personal favorite is inviting your legislators to come to your classrooms. That's a big one, having them come out and visit you to see what you do. A lot of times legislators have a vague idea of what early learning programs look like until they actually get into our classrooms. And then I think we blow people away because they don't understand how much actually goes into the care and education of our most vulnerable population. So that is an excellent way to do some legislative advocacy, is having your legislator, whether it's on your local level or a state level or a federal level, doesn't matter. Getting those people who have a say and have power over legislation are the ones that we want in our programs, and introducing them to the people that are their constituents. So I could get really excited, and I'm not going to. I want to, though. So the other piece of advocacy that I want to talk about is media. So this one is, social media is probably by far the one that we use the most. I know that even my own program, we have Facebook and we have Instagram and we have a YouTube channel. So we are posting to those constantly, whether it's events that we're putting on, or if it's, pictures of kids with permission, for families to see what we're up to in our classrooms, but also we're passing off information to people who follow us on social media about issues that deeply concern us. So when we see things coming down the pipeline, like the UPK and the TK and stuff that came out quite a few years ago, we actually knew that was coming down the pipeline, and we were able to let people know that we were getting ready to move to a different system to be able to meet the need of the TK. But we were able to do that through social media, using social media to or not just social media, but regular media, having reporters come to your classrooms and having conversations and talking to them about, the issues at hand. There's a great one. And Adam, you can jump in and remind me who it was, but one of our board members was interviewed by the newspaper down south somewhere, and was talking about the potty training and changing diapers and things like that was a real issue. And there's a lot of conflict between the teachers being able to change diapers as opposed to, like, in a nonprofit. Yeah. As a nonprofit, so for our program, it's not a big deal. We're not unionized or anything. So and it's part of our jobs, but some places it's not. So there's a lot of disconnect that way, but that's a great way to put that out there and let people know, not just the legislators, but the regular community know that there are issues or that need to be addressed, and they're not being addressed. It's also a great way, and it's not just all the bad stuff. We want to make sure that we're using media to highlight the amazing things that our teachers and staff are doing, the amazing things that our families are doing, and how amazing our kids are as well. We want to make sure that those are getting out there so that when people complain about taxes, we can say, but look at what your tax dollars are doing for our community in the youngest residents' lives. It's building them up. So it's media advocacy is also about bringing awareness to your local community and the greater community about what we do. I think that's it on advocacy. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do advocacy. It's not just lobbying. I know people get really hung up on that, but unless you are going to be spending the majority of your time lobbying to have regulations changed or create new legislation, I don't think you're going to have any issues. Just remember that advocacy looks different, and there's all kinds of different ways that you can advocate for your community and your families in a way that is going to highlight what the issues are and what is needed. And go on and go to the next slide. So as an individual, you always have the right to advocate for any issue, apart from being a part of your organization. There's nobody's saying that you can't advocate for certain issues that speak dearly to you. You just have to be really careful if you're doing it as yourself or if you're doing it as a representative of your organization, just because there's a real fine line right there. And if you're going to go advocate and you want to go do a march and it's not something that your work supports, that's great. You go do what you need to do. Just make sure that your work gear stays at work and you don't share certain things. You can advocate as part of an advocacy group. You can be yourself, or you can be part of a group of people. So I do ECE Voices. That's an advocacy group I'm part of. But I've also gone to the Hill in Washington, D.C. as part of Head Start meetings with our federal legislators and talk to the federal level about the issues facing families throughout the United States. But I've also gone to like a Black Lives Matter march as well, so as myself. So there's different things that you can do as an advocate without having to commit yourself to, I can only do it this way or I can only do it that way. And then, of course, nobody can take away your personal right to advocate for issues that are really important to you. That's your right here in the United States. You have the right to advocate for things that are important to you. Next slide, please.
Yeah, before we move on, I was wondering if I could just highlight, Celine put a comment in our chat that said, it is crucial that this is communicated with your employer. Do not lobby or advocate on behalf of your entity without their knowledge. And I will second that wholeheartedly. And sometimes you may want to, say, oh, I work for an organization that supports this cause. So that's something that I've had to do before. I was managing a public educational program, and I actually talked to our CEO and said, can we send this letter on behalf of this bill? And got his approval to go ahead and do that. So if you want your organization represented as part of the cause, just make sure that you're in communication with your employer.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. So some of the key takeaways that I would like for you guys to have today is that it's as an individual, you have no restrictions. Just make sure that you've removed your ECE Voices, Every Child California gear, your workplace gear. Don't use your job title, all that good stuff. So as an individual, you can go do whatever you want. However, when you're advocating on behalf of 501c3, you can't endorse candidates and you can't use the majority of your money from your nonprofit on advocacy activities. If you are going to advocate, you need to make sure your organization is behind it, just like Celine said. So thank you, Celine, for stating that. Ask for help if you are ever unclear. It's better to be safe than sorry. It never hurts to ask. I mean, the worst somebody can say is no, and then you just go back and regroup. And then even though no one can take away your personal right to advocate, lobby, and endorse a candidate, But if you do that on behalf of 501c3, just remember you risk them losing their tax exempt status. And that's a big deal because a lot of times grants and contracts that are available to nonprofits, you can't get unless you have that 501c3 status. So, all right, Jenny. All right. So based on your answers from the beginning, how are you guys feeling about advocating now? Do you feel better about it? Do you have any questions? Anybody? You guys are very silent today.
That's all right. Why don't we move on to our next poll? And if you have any thoughts in the meantime, if you have any questions that you have about our presentation today, feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute. Oh, Celine, that's a great question. Do most on the call work for a 501c3? Yeah, we'd love to know if you work for a 501c3 or a different type of organization. Feel free to call that out in the chat. Yes, thank you, Carla. How can community members and parents get involved with ECE Voices? And I'm going to share a little bit more about that in just a minute at the very end of our presentation. All right. And so I put together this short poll for us to do. I have 4 different examples of types of activities we can do. And we want to figure out, are these things advocacy or are these things lobbying? And I do believe we may have had a typo in one of our previous slides. And I just want to remind you that the definition of lobbying is that you're urging someone to vote a certain way, or you're trying to influence legislation, where advocating is simply maybe sharing your stories or educating someone about a cause. And so I'll give you a couple minutes to answer this poll. Your choices for all the questions are advocacy, it's allowed; lobbying, it's allowed; or lobbying that's only allowed as a private citizen. So there's just 4 examples for you. All right, I see those answers coming in. I'll give it 1 more minute. All right, we'll end the poll and talk about some of these answers. Okay, question 1. Using Facebook to share alarming news about proposed cuts to childcare funding. And if you're just sharing news without asking anyone to vote a certain way, that's just advocacy. Plain advocacy, sharing news. It is not considered lobbying. Number 2, endorsing a candidate for state assembly who supports early childhood education. Is it advocacy or is it lobbying? And it is lobbying, but it is only allowed as a private citizen because it is endorsing a specific candidate. It is a partisan activity. Number 3, asking your state senator to vote against a bill that would reduce funding for early childhood education and childcare. So that is considered lobbying because you're urging someone to vote for a certain piece of legislation. You're urging them to take an action on a legislation, but it is allowed for nonprofit organizations within that 1/3 amount that Jennifer mentioned before.
Mhm.
And then the last one, writing a letter to the governor about how a policy or budget decision has affected you as an early childhood educator in the past. And that's advocacy. That's sharing your personal story with an elected representative. And again, with all of those things, even if they're allowed for an organization to do, making sure that the organization you are representing is aware and approves of you representing them in that time. And then we're going to go back to our poll from the beginning to kind of review and recap. I'll give you a couple minutes to answer this poll again and see what we figured out from the training today. Adam, can you launch that poll for me? There we go, thanks. We have about half of our answers in, so we'll give it one more minute. All right, and we're going to go ahead and end the poll so we have some time to talk about the responses. Oops. Okay, so question 1, what is the best definition of a nonprofit? And the answer for this one is C, an organization that uses profits to serve their charitable activity. So that's that mission, that's that goal of service for the nonprofit. I know A was a little tricky, an organization that uses its profits to pay out dividends to shareholders. So that's a for-profit public company. They have shares on the stock market. When they have surplus revenue, they give that money to the people who have invested in them. So that is not a nonprofit. Number 2, is it illegal for nonprofits to advocate? And I'm so happy no one said always. And the answer is B, no, but there are some restrictions because again, it has to meet that definition of being a substantial part of your activities. And number 3, It could be the wording was a little bit tricky on this one. My 501c3 organization can participate in political campaigns. And so that means, endorsing a political candidate, funding a political candidate. And so the answer is B, false. Your 501c3 cannot participate in political campaigns. And number 4, can you engage in advocacy or political campaigns as a private citizen? And the answer is C, yes, on your personal time and or by making personal contributions. You can only use the resources from your nonprofit organization if you are engaging in advocacy that has been approved by your organization and meets their requirements. All right. And that is the end of our presentation today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to share a little bit, if you are not already a member of ECE Voices, this is a network of early childhood educators where we'll have mentors like Jennifer to support you. We'll learn how to advocate together. And we have a great wealth of information that we will share with you. It says you'll have my personal help setting up meetings, but I did not change that. That's Justina, our advocacy coordinator, is here to support all of our ECE Voices needs. Our next advocacy training is in 2 weeks on January 23rd. And that one's going to be all about contacting representatives, writing letters, and how to talk to legislators and legislative staff. The next day after that is actually really exciting. There is a Lifting Up Families Advocacy Day here in Sacramento, January 24th. More details are available on our website. And if you sign up for that and contact Justina about your desire to come and participate, ECE Voices does fund travel to come and attend these Advocacy Day events in Sacramento. So if you have any questions about that, any barriers to participating in the Advocacy Days, please reach out to Justina, advocacy@everychildca.org, because we want you to be there. We want you to join and we want you to share your story because, as Jennifer said, that's what's needed. We need our legislators to hear from you, and we're just so grateful that you're here with us. Jennifer, do you have anything to add before we leave?
No, just remember that advocacy is a million different things. It's not just one thing. And your stories matter. And it's your stories that change minds on a governmental level. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here tonight. And I look forward to advocating with you guys again, later.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Feel free to stick around if you have any questions you'd like to have answered, or you're welcome to take the rest of your evening. Have a great night.
Thank you.